Now we are going to talk about G20 summit. Political analyst Ross Feingold is joining us to discuss the summit that recently concluded in Brazil. Ross, thank you so much for joining us once again from all the way from Taiwan, Taipei. As major economies continue to prioritize their domestic agendas during the global summits, let's talk about that. Is the G20 losing its relevance as a platform for meaningful multilateral actions? Or is it merely adapting to a more fragmented world order? Let's start by with that.
Unfortunately, we see a lot of multilateral forums losing their relevance. That includes the G20 or the APEC meeting that preceded the G20 and which was held in Peru. Whether G20, G7, APEC, some of the other multilateral organizations, including the WTO, the World Trade Organization, for example, I would say they really have failed to reach expectations in recent years. In the distant past, there was a lot of hope that these organizations, or when the leaders have their annual summits, would solve a lot of global problems, whether in the trade space or in other areas. And now we see that these multilateral meetings, these multilateral organizations, they're simply not doing that. Now, there's a range of reasons why these organizations are failing to achieve what the broader public might have hoped for these organizations to achieve. But the clear result of these organizations and their annual meetings of global leaders is that they're not doing much.
Well, with only 5 permanent members holding veto power in the Security Council, the structure reflects a post-World War II world, and so many leaders are actually talking about it. President Erdogan is talking about it, and G20 was also talking about it as well this year. So how does the lack of representations for regions like Africa and Latin America undermine the UN's legitimacy in global governance, in your opinion?
Yes, it's a fair concern of what people call the global south, that they don't have adequate representation on the UN Security Council. I would think that at some point that's going to change. How soon is impossible to say. But I think there's a lot of support for changing the structure of the Security Council. But then we get the 5 permanent members are a little resistant to changing permanent members. Maybe they'll add rotating members that have a veto power. But clearly the 5 permanent members are reluctant to give up some of their existing authority. But I think it's fair to say that there'll be some changes to the Security Council in the future. A big factor now in the next 4 years is going to be whether or not the Trump administration favors that. The Biden administration was very open-minded to that concept. They supported changing the structure of the Security Council and the permanent members. But will the Biden administration be supportive of that? I think that's a big question mark.
Well, let's talk about the Trump's administration then, because it is coming up in the G20. It was the only thing that all of the leaders were wondering about. Probably Trump is coming up to the work, and once again he has been talking about tariffs once again. And during the times like this, during the finances like this, what would you say that the world, especially the world diplomacy, is expecting with the Trump's stance that he has happened to have in his previous administration?
Well, they need to have some concern and even skepticism, because President Trump is going to be looking at how to make America first part of his foreign policy. And sometimes that includes skepticism of multilateral organizations. That's just a fact. So we shouldn't sit here today and think that Trump or his foreign policy team are going to embrace multilateral organizations. For example, during the first Trump presidency, the United States, the Trump administration announced that the United States was withdrawing from the World Health Organization. Unfortunately for Trump, he wasn't reelected in 2020, so he couldn't see that through. And Biden said, we're not withdrawing, we're going to re-engage with the World Health Organization. So certainly global leaders who put a lot of faith and have a lot of hope in multilateral organizations, they have to be prepared for the possibility that the Trump organization is going to withdraw. Now, sometimes the Trump organization is withdrawing because they're concerned that China has too much influence in multilateral organizations. So it's possible, for example, with the World Health Organization, that the Trump administration will say, we're withdrawing from the WHO, but we're going to look to create a new health organization with like-minded countries And that would exclude China, that would exclude Russia, and maybe some other countries would decide not to participate. But the United States would look to proceed with so-called like-minded countries in a new World Health Organization. So there's definitely a lot of unknown when it comes to the multilateral organization space.
Well, let's talk about people facing hunger in 2023, because 733 million of them is existing. The G20 declaration emphasizes hunger eradication. How realistic are these commitments in addressing such staggering numbers?
That's a very concerning issue for NGOs and multilateral organizations that try to remedy these problems. With the Trump administration coming in, we know that President Trump, he's not a big fan of humanitarian intervention. He's not a fan of sending the U.S. military to try and keep two sides of a civil war somewhere in the developing world apart. That's just not a role that he foresees for the United States. And he also doesn't foresee a role for the United States in resolving humanitarian crises in whether that's in Africa or Southeast Asia or other parts of the world. So he's definitely skeptical of American intervention to remedy problems like civil wars or humanitarian disasters. And other countries that think they should intervene, then they're going to have to step up and fulfill the role that the United States might not fulfill under a Trump administration.
Well, let's talk about Biden's focus on condemning Hamas and supporting Israel, contrasting with G20's generalized language, because G20 was highlighting this situation in Palestine rather differently. Does this divergence reveal fractures within the Western bloc or merely differing approaches in the diplomacy?
Definitely fractures have been growing. So over the course of the war in Gaza and more recently the war in Lebanon, we see European countries are more willing to criticize Israel. And the United States, frankly, does not criticize Israel. They express concern, but ultimately the Biden administration has been very supportive of Israel. But I think countries that are concerned about Israel's action or they're concerned about United States policy, they have to be realistic, because the Trump administration coming in on January 20th, 2025 is going to be very supportive of Israel, whether that's in Gaza or in Lebanon. So the global community that is angry at Israel, again, they're not going to get U.S. support with what they want to do to remedy Israel's policies. And the United States is going to be very supportive of Israel.
Well, thank you so much, Ross, for joining us. That was a quite detailed G20 summit, and we are probably going to talk about the international summits a lot with the new U.S. president and how his reflection of the world of diplomacy is going to unfold in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.